Welcome to the Babel Digital Communicators Podcast. I am not Jenny Mowat, but Marcus Edinburgh, campaign director at Babel PR. And today we have a very special guest with us to talk about cutting through the noise in cybersecurity. And that person is none other than the very prolific cybersecurity journalist Dan Raywood, who has both freelanced and worked as a staff writer for a variety of tech trades and security news outlets over the last nearly 20 years, including but not limited to InfoSecurity, Dark Reading, Computer Weekly, IT Security Guru, and SC Magazine, where he's currently a senior editor. You've even been an enterprise security analyst with 451 Research, if I'm not mistaken. So, but where are my manners? I will let the man introduce himself more formally. Have I done you justice?
I think so. I think that's a good kind of array. Yeah, it does sound like quite a varied career from all that history. Yeah. I got into cybersecurity back in 2008, and it's the most undramatic story that I had just been... How do I put this? Let go from my last role. The previous role to that I'd been caught up in the credit crunch and the mortgage crisis, and then after that a job which just that didn't really worked out, and then a recruitment guy said I can put you in touch with a job with SC Magazine UK, back then working for a company called Haymarket, and this was summer 2008. Freelance, couple of days a week turned into a full-time job, and that turned into 5 years. SC Magazine. I'm still in cybersecurity, so it's a really good industry. And I don't know if I'm jumping ahead on questions here, but I think
no, you're fine.
I think kind of one of the people sort of say, what keeps you in it. What do we?
I was going to ask that.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask what madness drove you in.
Yeah, what madness drove cybersecurity? Well, it's funny one. So before cybersecurity, so the one I worked for very briefly was in about payroll. I worked with one with the credit crunch was about for mortgage brokers at B2B. I spent 4 years as editor of a magazine for the garment decoration industry. So I'd really kind of swung around. There were two others as well. I won't with the whole list. You can find me on LinkedIn. Look to them if you really are that interested. But yeah, the one that really got me about cybersecurity is I got in so it was September 08, August 08 I started freelancing for SC, and then September I started working full time. And then I would call that just as things started to turn really bad, if I put it that way. It was very much sort of just as things started to go more nation state based. You started to see more bigger data breaches. You started to see more kind of noted attacks in the major headlines. So those of you with a memory might remember Conficker, which was a worm that was due to sort of I don't want to explode. It's a terrible word. Kind of activate. That's the word I'm looking for. I think it was 1st of May 2009, and we were kind of all on tenterhooks. What's going to happen? Talking to our threat research contacts and all that kind of stuff. So that was the first really big one we covered, and then after that it was Stuxnet in 2010. From then it really all changed. And the thing I guess I really like about cybersecurity still is it never really stops kind of with stuff like that. You get, I don't want to say get bored, because if I was bored I wouldn't be doing it, but you find content all the time going, here's new ways of doing this. It's really interesting to see new ideas come around all the time of like, here's a new way of doing things, and here's a new attack, and all that kind of stuff. And there's enough to keep a whole range of journalists busy, whether it's national press, whether it's business to business like I've done, or analysts like I also did. Everyone's got a bit of a part to play.
It's interesting you talk about that shift over the last, especially decade. It just feels like there's been so much stuff happening in the cybersecurity in the news cycle, especially around data breaches. So one question I have for you is, if you had to pick the 2 or 3 most interesting cybersecurity stories, which ones would they be?
The ones that really stand out, I mean, this actually kind of ties in 2 stories, which is basically about supply chain security. And that was regarding the Synovis attack back in June. This was a provider of, I think they were lab facilities. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what they do, but they had connections into several NHS trusts in southeast London. And they hit a ransomware attack on this company. And it was almost what really I still think makes it interesting is I was literally writing about 2 stories a week on this. It never got boring. And that reason why is because Synovis and NHS England were very good at keeping us up to date on what was going on. And a couple of others, I guess the the MOD coming out and saying we've been hacked. This was just as I started back up at SC, which I'm sure we'll cover. Coming out and saying we've been hacked. We've also seen quite and they were accusing China, and I think we've seen quite a lot of focus on China as a threat actor this year. I think in the last couple of years, it's probably been more towards Russia because of Ukraine, but I think now we're seeing much more focus on China. And I think there's been a few cases of Chinese state-sponsored attackers being sort of giving a bit more attention in terms of how serious it's being given.
I'm curious, are there any particular cybersecurity topics that you feel are underrepresented or underreported? You just wish there were more CISOs or whoever talking about that?
Well, I'll pick up the other big trend which everyone's talking about, which of course is AI. You can't have a conversation in cybersecurity without thinking about AI. I think the interesting thing about AI is we still talk about it as like everyone seems to think they know all about it, and I don't know if we do. When you mentioned what would CISOs do, the CISOs I talk about, like how are you using it, what are you using it for, and I've had some comments come in and stuff like that. We're doing it for data threat aggregation, we're doing it for reduce the noise, as it were. But also I've seen it talk about the problems it has in trying to train like a data set. How do you generate it with enough data sets, I should say. How do you train the defensive AI, for example, or stuff like that? So I guess that's probably the big one really is what do we deserve more attention, is less on the hype of X number of CISOs think AI is a problem versus X number I think is your opportunity. We probably have seen both of those. Ultimately, as a writer, the first priority really is your reader. And what are you trying to do to to enable them, to help them? The one thing of all the various roles I've held, the one I remember got drummed into me quite early on at IT Security Guru is like, how do we produce content that helps our readers do their job better? And that's kind of been in my mind ever since. It's a bit like what can I provide to them that actually helps them? So I know we'll talk surveys later on, but just to jump ahead slightly, a survey content for me, if like one I did quite recently was like 90% of CISOs don't know if they should be compliant with NIST 2, and it's like that actually is quite helpful, I think, because when we did GDPR and we were run up there, we got lots of questions and lots of attendance. Any webinars we did about GDPR, and with NIST 2, it's like I don't know if you can't ring up a Citizens Advice Bureau and say, should I be compliant with this? You got to talk to your auditor. And we've got DORA coming up in literally a matter of weeks, or compliance with DORA. So that kind of thing I think is always really interesting to actually sort of say, you're not the only one worrying about this or being concerned about this. You should think about how many others are actually having this problem, and here's the reality of that.
And on my favorite topic, which is on today's episode of how not to PR or how not to communicate, if you will, what are your biggest pet peeves about how PRs and comms teams tend to engage with you and the wider press? I know that it's been said by more than a few members of the media that we tend to live up to the slogan of mistakes were made. So
I think it's an interesting dynamic still between journalists and PR. I think I've had the fortunate say I've been covering of the 16 and a half years, probably almost years I've been covering cybersecurity. I've had a little bits of that time I wasn't working directly with PR because I did work vendor side for a couple of years, but most of the time I have. Actually, what I joked about when I rejoined SC UK back in, it was technically March, but we went live in April. I joked about how big the UK cyber industry really still was, and how many PR people there still were involved in, which I think is great. I think that people will go, the reason the media hasn't got any money is because it goes into PR. It's like, yeah, but it's going into brand development, it's going into crisis communications, it's going into all the things that we preach about that businesses should be doing better about response and being able to actually communicate. I mentioned that the Synovis updates, and even CrowdStrike, yes, took them a while to get on because they're probably trying to figure out what was going on too. But I think from the PR dynamic, it's changed because I think mainly just the number of press around has just gone down quite a lot. I can point back to things like roundtables I was doing in the early 2010s, where you get maybe half a dozen, 10 journalists show up. These days you might not get so many. Just that's not because people aren't interested, it's just because that there just aren't that many people around. But on the same side, what you're seeing, on the opposite side I should say, what you're now seeing is a lot of people working more for national press. So you go to a roundtable, you might see people from Sky News, BBC, The Guardian, The Telegraph. But once upon a time, I'd only see myself working for SC or Info Security, Computer Weekly, or people like that from these other publications. I did a few events in the summer where I'd go off and I'd sort of see, okay, where are you from? I'm from that mag, and you're like, okay. So to get to your point about pet peeves, now I think probably the biggest challenge I do think is that there's a lot of time that you do wonder is that the person representing or working for the PR company actually aware of what your publication does? Have they looked at your kind of coverage, or is it just this kind of element of like, let's just try and get everyone's attention? So I try and help and actually respond to emails and go, yeah, no, we don't cover product announcements, we don't cover partnerships. That's not a blanket no, because I mentioned just before, there's this Microsoft tool about recovery tool, which I thought was worth covering. We did a news and brief on it. Maybe we didn't have a huge amount of detail at that point. It was actually covered in some of the big podcasts as well, and they didn't have information either. But things like announcements that maybe what I tend to call it is like there's a difference between company news and industry news. The way I see it is what's of interest to your company, what's of interest to the wider industry. It sounds a bit derogatory, but
there's a difference.
What goes on the company newsletter versus what goes in an industry title. Now, if it's a partnership with, or we've just achieved, compliance with this standard, okay, no, that's interesting. There might be future reference if I need to talk to someone about NIS2, for example. We just hired a new sales and marketing director. You really want that covered, and you really think. I mean, now I'm not saying no, because things like appointment stories, you might think, okay, I'm not going to cover the new sales director. I do get those sorts of things. It's like that's very interesting. In a way, you might sort of think, do I even know this person? Where do they come from? Are they new to industry? But at the same time, if there's like a new CEO, and let's just say the CEO of company X has moved to become CEO of company J, you might think, okay, that's interesting. What's caused that? Are they changing up? Is it because company X was acquired by venture capitalists? Like I say, there's no kind of blanket not going to be interested on anything. It's more a case of let's kind of realise what actually is worthwhile covering. And then, unfortunately, some days just are busy for news-wise, and it's. I feel sorry for anyone who has to picture something when something big happens. And the story I'll often point to, or the incident I'll point to, was someone who actually was issuing an embargoed press release, and it was like the morning they withdrew it because Steve Jobs died, and I got an email saying, yeah, we're going to be holding this back till like 5 days or whatever it is, I'm going to push it back a week, because they realised that okay, yes, that, and where I was working at the time was SC UK, we probably did something on it because. At the end of the day, Steve Jobs isn't a cybersecurity leader. He was obviously one of the biggest names in computing. But in terms of the national press, now they're covering cybersecurity. Yeah, you're not going to get any love out of them those days. But yeah, it's a trick. And I think one thing I would sort of go to take away is always try and have a look at what the publication you're trying to pitch actually, what's their interest, what's their focus. Are they consumer first? I get a lot of things like consumer, and it's like, we don't really do that. Black Friday was a tricky one for that. But, that's always my takeaway. Sorry, long-winded answer.
No,
how do you what does the publication do, and how do what we trying to pitch, how does that fit into what they cover?
I'm also curious, in terms of all the publications that you've worked at before, I mean, there's been a wide range of them, but what do you find ordinarily tends to perform the best in terms of traffic? What kind of stories, generally speaking, are they?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a joke journalists will have is never look at the numbers, because something you work on really, really hard and you don't get much attention, while something just as a bit of a throwaway piece can be the biggest story of the week. There's a few things that are predictable. I think our most read story on SC UK was probably the CrowdStrike one, just because of the time, and we were able to get something up quite early. Though, as a big mistake, I failed to put CrowdStrike in the headline. So I think I put Windows, because it was obviously at the time something affecting Microsoft Windows. So even now I search for it, and I'm in our website going, where is it? And I'm like, yeah. And of course, the way SEO works. Once you've put in URL works, I should say. Once you've put in a headline, you can't change the URL because then it will be 404. So yes, you kind of you can change around the text as much as you like after it's live, but you can't change the headline or you can't change the URL. So yes, and that was a bit of a mistake. Yeah, it's often a tricky one because we talk about compliance. We were doing. So I was covering GDPR from when I was at SC Magazine last time. I think I got my first through in about 2012. So 6 years, right up until 2018, when it actually became law, as it were. The regulation became from a directive to regulation, and we that was always really popular because people didn't know, and we would do things like webinars where we'd get questions like, I'm the secretary of a gardening club and I've got everybody's email address in a spreadsheet. Am I out of compliance with GDPR? I mean, that might sound laughable, but that's actually quite a serious thing. I have an iron key, secure USB with goodness knows how many spreadsheets of email addresses from over the years of places I've worked, and most of which probably people who don't work there anymore. That's often the problem with keeping databases. But I think anything around compliance is always good because I think ultimately governance, risk and compliance is what really drives cybersecurity forward in terms of how things are done, because they're the sort of the bent, what's the word, kind of like the barriers that we all work between, everybody works between, and you've got to keep compliant with these particular standards, say whether it's GDPR, NIS2, DORA coming up, ISC 27001. That's what you have to stick to. So that's always a good one. At the same time, I think I personally find that the nation state thing's a little bit tenuous sometimes, APT whatever, called something, rabbit or something. But that's something I have a bit of a bugbear with, and I will run an article one day about attribution. Does it actually matter? And actually, conversations I've gone both ways. But I think the thing with nation state is that I've seen the national press at roundtables I've done and press events. That's what the consumer, the regular paper reader is going to be interested in. Is going to be the element of who did it, are we being attacked by Russia, are we being attacked by North Korea? The WannaCry attacks 2017 were attributed to North Korea. Did they do it? We don't know. It's still an interesting one, but it does get headlines. So yeah, from the sort of most popular stuff, it's what's going to grab the sort of the attention of the reader, and then you think, yeah, that does come on you then as a writer going, can I write the dazzling headline?
Yeah, sure. Well, that might be a good segue, I think, to what makes a trusted source, and if you have any in your, figuratively speaking, back pockets, what is it that makes them a credible and trusted source to get your info from?
I think, it's a fair question, and I think I've had conversations with people going, who do you have people you go to for certain things? Probably a bit less so these days. When you're doing a lot more. So when I was in info security, we had freelance news writers, and I was doing a lot more like longer form writing. So let's say, for example, it's a story about DDoS. For example, I did do a long article on DDoS once, and I'm like, okay, well, for DDoS, I should probably talk to these 2 or 3 companies because they're the leading providers. I'll chat to like Gartner, for example. Just turned out that week I was at a Gartner conference, so that worked out pretty well. But I think ultimately, you want to try. You meet a lot of people over the years. Probably a bit less these days now that post COVID, don't see as many people doing most face-to-face meetings anymore. But you kind of go through and you think, okay, that person was very good. Let's talk a bit more with them. I tend to probably go more for somewhere like talk to the kind of the consultancies and the big and the independent consultants when it comes to anything more end user, because they, for me, have the wider perspective of how something is going. So, give for example, like let's say NIS2. Let's pick on that one again. They're going to know more about NIS2 compliance for 10 companies than one CISO, because all he knows about or they know about is their company. So, trusted sources. You will pick up people who let's put it this way, don't just talk products. That can be a bit of a turn off. If someone is just going to talk, what the marketing team sort of say, this is what you should cover. I'm not saying that, I know the opposite with someone who goes completely rogue might be a marketing person's nightmare, and I have heard those stories, and they're trying to keep them on a leash, to stop them going right. But that's when the press will talk to them the most. I think it's just there's people with good insight, people with, good perspective of outside of what their their focus is this one thing, but they can talk about a broad range of things with actually the expertise. I think there's quite a capability to spot someone who's a bit of a shyster at quite a short pace, and understand those who don't actually really know what they're talking about will get found out. And I don't think we've had many of those, but thankfully, the ones who are out there and prepared to give their time, and you will get to know them, they get to know you, and over time, the ones, and also being responsive is always good. I know that sounds a little tricky, but if you contact someone saying, "Oh, do you have time to talk?" and a lot of journalists, they wanted it 10 minutes ago.
Yeah. I know that pain.
They did. They wanted everything was done.
Time differences too.
Well, anyone's ever worked, obviously I don't work in television, but I know what television's like. When did you want it? Oh, about an hour ago. Can you come in at 5 a.m. and do sunrise? That's always a consideration, availability. And I do sort of, obviously we don't expect people to drop everything at the last minute and say, yes, I can talk. I know some who will, and who are very good. No names mentioned, but there's some really, really good people who will literally they will ring me back. And at the same time, I will not know people who I would just talk to casually, and this has happened more than once, where someone in particular, and I'll say, oh, by the way, have you seen the new NCSC annual review? And he's like, give me 2 minutes. Puts the phone down, rings back with so-and-so from Babel PR. Hi, it's Marcus here from Babel PR. Oh, right, I've got so-and-so online, and we carry on the conversation, but with PR sort of watching over what they're saying. So, availability is one of the key things. If the person is, knowledgeable and has good perspectives, and actually they can use, obviously, off-the-record conversations if they need to be. They're not always that useful. If it's not something you can actually use, then why say it? And availability is probably the other thing. Can you sort of give something back in the time you need it? Some people like give email over comments over email, I should say. Some people like questions in advance. Some people like this, that, and the other. You figure out over time ones who actually will be responsive, and you tend to stick with those.
On that note, I wanted to get your take on what makes a comment actually useful to you. What are the characteristics of a decent comment?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we do get a lot of comments over email. I got no problem with kind of I don't know what the right word for it be, kind of but comments that come in over email. Here's what my client said about this, which you didn't ask for. I have workplaces where you wouldn't use that. That's just the policy. Sometimes that can be tricky. I'd be honest, that can be tricky if you're trying to turn something around fast. So that's often the thing. I think sometimes you do read a comment going, you've kind of glossed around it. You've almost like, if the question is, I guess the attribution thing, does it matter that we attributed, or that wouldn't be the question you'd ask, attribution of WannaCry to North Korea. Let's go back to 2017 or 18, whenever that attribution came out. What does it matter to a CISO who actually did this? If that's a question you ask, no. If you get a comment back going, then they've glossed around it, they've not really answered it. Now, the reason why sometimes you might not get someone answering that, because, let's be brutally honest, no one wants to put themselves in the firing line of North Korean hackers.
Yeah.
Number two, we get that commercial companies are bound a little bit by what they can say. They don't want to kind of upset government contracts, for example. So again, another instance, once upon a time, working with a bunch of companies, and so company wouldn't talk about one particular breach. Actually, I'll say the breach was eBay. So I'm going to guess about 14. The companies I was talking to, one wouldn't talk. Why? Because eBay was a customer, and it makes pretty perfect sense, really. You wouldn't want to go criticising one of your biggest payers, So and that's the thing, actually, how much can the company say? So when you are looking for a comment, you are looking for someone who's actually going to answer your question, which sounds really stupid when you say, can you answer the question? Give me the answer I actually want. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who will gloss around it. And actually, some of the kind of stock comments you might get 6 paragraphs. And actually, 2 lines of that might be really good, and that's the bit you'll use. So it comes on you to try and actually look for sort of a comment within a comment within the comment, break down the bit that actually is useful, and then you might follow that up. Yes, like I said, companies are bound by what they can actually say. They don't want to upset too many people by saying the wrong thing. But a good comment really should be at least answering the question you're trying to get the point of. Sometimes when you're writing the story, you really might be looking at going, okay, I could really do with a perspective here of this is what I think, and then you might think, okay, who actually would talk about that? Now, some people might say, we only want end user comments. No, that's not going to happen, because the CISO of a Fortune 500 isn't going to stand up and say, I think we should, lock up all the hackers. They're not going to do that, because A, that's a stupid thing to say, and B, they can't do it, and C, put yourself back in the firing line. But I think to be a good comment, really, just try and actually consider, what you know about it. Don't kind of blag it and sort of hope that, there's something you're going to use. Look to actually answer the question, offer the advice. And always, I think, always just sort of say, so-and-so is available today, go back to availability. This person is available for further comment. It's like, well, you've got 2 lines out of the 60 words you've sent me. 60 lines, that's a lot of that. But, I actually say, can they talk a bit further about why they think this? And that's always a good thing to have. Again, it does take down to time, and, you might find that person is now in meetings all day with, PR, being told not to say these things. But at the same time, and then, okay, let's go, that falls flat. So it can be a tricky one, trying to find good people to say good things. But over time, you will find people who actually are reliable and, who do have good perspectives.
One question that comes to mind there is just, it must be, with going back to this idea of how much noise there is, it must be kind of difficult to verify the authenticity and the credibility of the comments you receive. I mean, do you have an approach for vetting people?
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's you do look around. I mean, I wouldn't. Maybe in the past we've been a little bit kind of, and this isn't just me, I probably haven't been a little bit more kind of like, it's marketing director, and you're like, well, yeah, but I've met marketing directors who have come from a very tech background, so I don't think we should be so snooty about kind of what someone's job title is. You're probably more likely to get something more interesting out of them than you are out of a CEO. Now, unless the CEO is a kind of like someone who's been very dynamic in the past in terms of white hat hacking and all that kind of stuff. Look at companies like, where's a few, I won't name them on your podcast because they're not your clients, but there's a lot of companies out there who have been involved in whether it's penetration testing or even been on sort of the grey side of things, who actually have got that expertise, and they've been born out of doing something, and then they have actually got that knowledge, or they're business people. Now, I can think of several companies coming to mind who do those kind of things, where a business person is maybe not going to know the deep down side of how something was done, whether the CrowdStrike incident probably took several days for everyone to really understand what exactly had happened, but the techies we talked to, or certainly those we communicated with, understood a bit more of what had happened, and we got the basics down. But yeah, verifying, it is a tricky one. I do find these days there's people less out to catch journalists out, if that makes sense, because I was explaining to someone recently, back in sort of early 2010s, I saw a couple of things literally trying to sort of literally fake news, fake sort of joke stories almost, and one of them was about people who use Internet Explorer have a lower IQ. Now, I didn't end up writing this mainly because I was just really busy that week and I didn't get around to looking at it. A few websites did, they published this, and it turns out it was a kind of hoax upon the press. Now, I don't see that sort of much anymore, which is good, because I put my hand up going, I didn't get called out. No, it's because I was just really, really busy and I hadn't got around to it. But like I said, I know some others did, and I don't think you get that so much. I mean, the days of April Fool's jokes, press releases. The problem with the April Fool's thing is you do it well or just don't bother. And the problem was several companies did it really well. And one of those was Google. They did just some excellent stuff. And it was funny and it was intelligent and it was well produced. Just doing a sort of slightly daft press release. It's like, is it really worth your time doing some... And I won't say which company said, we're going to put a data center on the moon, and it's like, I'm just not going to credit this, because I can't be bothered. But I think I come back to an earlier point about the number of press are around. You are dealing with veracity. You've got to verify things. There are some bad people around. I don't mean hackers. I mean people who have not been particularly pleasant to others in the industry, and giving those people airtime can be a consideration. You don't want to give someone who has let's just say, done some bad things to other people in our industry, and all of a sudden they're popping up as a spokesperson. Then you've got to try and verify people to say, do you go to those trusted commenters that we mentioned earlier on, and you say, is this person, you ever come across them? Now, I speak from experience. I did have an incident once where I talked to someone who had been engaged in some not very pleasant behaviour, and upon quoting them and putting in a story, I was then told by one of my trusted contacts, this person's a bit of a bad egg, so I removed it eventually. But verifying one, it's not something you would have to do often, because actually if it comes via a PR company, a trusted one like Babel, then you're going to know that it's gone through the sort of the verification of both of all the company they work for. Secondly, going to go through the verification of the PR company, and it gets to me. And it's like, if it gets to me and they really are a bad egg, then I have to kind of go back and go, this comment doesn't make any sense, or I don't think we should be quoting this person because they're currently on an arrest charge or something like that. Same way that you probably wouldn't be pushing them. So, verification, it's not something I would say we do often. It's not something you kind of go and check, is this person speaking the right thing? Because we do tend to work at quite a pace to get things out. But it's probably something we should do more. Who knows, maybe something we could do more of in the future.
Are there any creative comms campaigns or PR activities in the cybersecurity space that have really caught your attention in the last year? Any kind of tactics used that really made you go, ooh, what's going on there?
Yeah, but April Fool's jokes, you mean?
Yeah.
Generally, I wouldn't say anything that's really been kind of huge. Generally, I think it's been pretty much similar. I do see a lot of contact still with, I think a lot of new vendors coming around actually, and that's always a tricky one when it's an established PR person or company and it's like, got this new client, you're like, okay, we're going to start again, aren't we? Trying to figure out what you do, what you talk about, where you specialise, and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of actually specific campaigns, I guess the joke a bit like with the numbers, you always kind of look at the most memorable one is the last one you looked at. Not the one that really came out like 7 months ago. Okay, what did that happen? What was stood out about that? Nothing particularly huge from this year. I think it's been quite a common year. Again, following the CrowdStrike incident, we had this with WannaCry back in 2017. A lot of people jumping on the bandwagon of like, we think this. It's like, well, no one really knows anything yet, so let's kind of hold the horses until we actually know what's going on. With the WannaCry thing, it was a Friday night. Anyone who's around then remembers. Or Friday afternoon anyway. So sort of most of my weekend was lost to doing media stuff, which is fine. But I got my inbox was just full of comments, and I'm looking through going, don't these people actually know what this is? So again, going back to being insightful in the comments, but actual campaigns, probably nothing huge has really stood out. I think we'll get on to trends, but I think a lot of trends have stayed fairly similar. So I think it's, just a lot of still pretty solid kind of PR campaigns that generally, most things I look at and then, no offence, but I've forgotten about 20 minutes later because I finished the story, so yeah.
And speaking of trends, where do you think the industry is going?
So the one that's actually stood out was more use of managed services or managed detection response, which I thought that's an interesting one, how actually people are less likely to go and purchase the technology and more using a managed service. Whether that comes down to cost, I don't know, but that's an interesting one from a tech trend of how actually we're looking more to people to purchase the rights to use a service rather than actually purchasing it outright. But that's not the same for everyone. Some people don't have that capital to put money up and buy something. Some do. That's just the way business works. And I think just the AI conversation won't go away, just because I think there is still so much to be learned around how it's used for defence. A lot of the conversation we have is around, especially a lot of I did some articles for a couple of companies, and I see a lot of like surveys coming in going, AI has made the process of building an attack much easier because the lower cost of entry. That's always the term I use. Lowers the barrier for entry, the cost of entry. All of a sudden, because you can use ChatGPT to build your phishing campaign, you can use an AI to send all your attacks out. You can automate this kind of thing. You can do it at midnight to do it to a specific thing. It does save a lot of time, but I think the defensive AI thing is actually just as crucial a conversation. So pretty predictable. Business resilience, AI, and I forgot the first one was because I've gone on so long. But I managed services. I think there's nothing in there that you probably wouldn't have seen in previous years. I guess the only other quick one, which I don't really see so much talk about, is mobile anymore. He says looking at his mobile phone on the table, talking into a mobile phone. I don't see so much mobile threats anymore. There was a number of years in the early, mid-2010s when that was the big prediction every year was we're going to see more mobile malware, we're going to see more mobile malware. And now I guess our mobiles are as akin kind of operating systems as to our computers now. Certainly not as fully detailed, but they've got pretty thick. But I don't see so much of that anymore, which I'm not complaining about because I thought it was fairly. Every year it was fairly predictable that we'd get something on that, but nothing ever happened. It just got worse and worse. But I think now we're sort of seeing more kind of talk about what's the word? Like permissions, for example. What you're granting. Are you granting the apps? What can they do? What can they see? And then that comes down to the developers of the apps. Actually, are they adhering to data collection regulations? Maybe it's the advent of GDPR which changed all of that. Maybe that stopped people being so kind of bad with things. But that's where I don't see so much is mobile. So that could be one to keep an eye on, just if things are changing there.
One final question for you. As we sign off, what advice would you give to either cybersecurity teams or comms professionals who are trying to engage with you?
I'd say just, it's not a science to try and talk to the press. They're available. They're also, kind of, what's the word? I don't want to say kind of, they're very suspicious lot. We probably are. But yeah, there's not that many press around. We do kind of look around, okay, what's an interesting story? I think that there was a big change moment with the Snowden story, the Snowden incident back in, 2011 possibly that was. I say it was 2013, I think, actually. Where all of a sudden, you went from you had this situation where this whistleblower contacted one journalist, and to sort of get the story out. And I think ever since then, they talked about the hoax stories earlier on. Now you've got the situation where journalists are kind of like, would that ever be me? Would the whistleblower from the NSA or GCHQ contact Dan Raywood? So just, there was people being kind of, cautious of like, I want to try and get good stories, but at the same time I'm conscious of being, hacked as well. So there's an element of that. I'd say just trying to keep, be honest about what you're trying to talk about. Be kind of considerate of a number of people you're trying to deal with. Once upon a time you might have had a whole team of reporters. Now you might only have one, and they might only be part-time like I am. If you're trying to sort of push a message, then that people will be kind of aware of that. If it's a product marketing message, then totally fine. But just try and consider, what does your message do? What makes it stand out? What makes it unique from everything else we're hearing? And just be considerate, how much can you actually give? If it's a survey, then that's fine. I tend to run a lot of surveys as news in briefs these days. They're very easy to write. To sort of turn a survey into a three or four paragraph story. But if you're kind of looking, if you're trying to push, here's a spokesperson who wants to talk about this. Just kind of consider, okay, well, it's a bad time of year, we're working on this, but maybe I'll come back to it. And, I often, if it's something I'm genuinely interested in, I'll come out going, I can't do it now, but circle back with me in January. I've literally done a few of those already in the last few weeks. So be considerate of, first of all, time. Not everyone's got unlimited time to spare. Look at, what actually, if an interview does take a long time to prepare, write, produce, and also, if you are working on a long form piece, then you might only need to do a certain number of words. You don't need lots of comments coming in. So, there's no kind of formula to it really. It's just be considerate of people who don't have a huge amount of time on their hands and probably are getting pitched from every single angle with different ideas. Which ones are going to stand out, and how do you make yours stand out? So it's probably the sort of the baton passed back really is how well do you think your kind of campaign stands out?
Excellent. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you on the next Babel podcast, or maybe you'll see someone different in this chair. Who knows? It's always different.